Welcome to episode 11 of the Can I Tell You Something podcast. We have an episode that, if you look around at the visuals that we're providing, has to do with plants and nature.
Yes, and if you're only listening, you can imagine us in our studio with, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plants surrounding us. And that's because this week we are finally talking about some newish research that's come out about plants and the feelings they might have and how they communicate with one another.
Which the rabbit hole I went down was fascinating for this episode because I've heard some murmurings about how plants are talking to one another. But the truth behind it all and the research that they're doing, I just had no idea what was happening. So it's very exciting to me. And I can't wait to share this with you and for us to approach this episode with a mix of this is what's going on, but also let's talk about what this means maybe a bit more philosophically.
Yeah, and that's kind of what the structure of this episode is going to be. So Brendan is going to be presenting some of the facts for us all because we have to ground ourselves in that. And then I'll be philosophizing from those facts, and we'll kind of do that throughout the episode.
So this episode has 3 guiding questions, and I'm going to list them off. So get your ears focused in on this because this is the core of what we're going to talk about today. The first is what makes plants different than animals. The second, when does something become life or alive? And third, at what point is life entitled to human rights? So those are the 3 questions. There's a bunch of fascinating takes that already exist out there on all of them. And I just want to clarify that no one knows the answers to any of these. So don't think that you should know the answer. The idea is that we're all kind of playing along and trying to get some sort of truth out of this. So
yeah, and we're going to obviously talk through these. And if you agree or even disagree, let us know below or send us a DM on our silly little social medias, which I'll pop on the screen right now.
Yes.
Because we'd really want to hear from you on this topic specifically. I think there's going to be opinions all across the board, especially with those questions. And so I'm excited to see what you all think.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first section that I'm going to talk about is how plants talk to one another. So I'm curious, how do you think plants would communicate? If you were a tree, how would you talk to your other trees?
I'm assuming that it has something to do with their roots because we know, and I guess I'm just going off of that aspen tree study that was done a while ago, that aspens are the largest living organism in the world because I don't know if it's in the United States or where it is, but it's just they're all connected somehow through their roots. And so I'd assume for trees at least that is how they send each other nutrients or communicate in some sort of way through that. But then I'd imagine in maybe a forest or specifically a rainforest setting that might be very, very different because now you have layers of plants upon each other. And so maybe it's the leaves or some sort of alternate communication. But I would assume that every living plant, except for maybe in a desert, is going to be near other plants. And so it's safe to assume that they're communicating constantly. So
this is where we'll first start to dive into how we can think about how plants communicate with one another. There are 2 different things to think about, is what is happening above ground and what is happening underground. So we have the leaves, we have all the greenery around us right here to illustrate that, but what you aren't seeing are the roots underneath. And so these studies kind of outline that plants communicate through their roots, their stems, their leaves, their flowers, and their fruit. So they can actually communicate across a whole variety of different parts of them. The other thing, too, is when we think about how plants communicate with one another, or even within their own body system, there are a couple things to think about. One, for us humans, we think about our nervous system as being all of these electrical wires,
which look like roots.
Which
I always find super fascinating. Total tangent here.
Yeah.
But when you look into the human body and our anatomy, how much like our internal structures reflect the universe.
Yes.
And how like people are like, oh, your eyes look like the sky. And yeah, like your nervous system looks like plant roots. And I find that really fascinating. I just had to throw that in there.
I'll throw in another fascinating bit too. So in the whole space of computer science and like how we organize information and structure stuff, a lot of the models that we talk about are based off of trees or tree maps or like relationships between branches, roots, parents, children, that sort of stuff. So it's funny how we find all these parallels because that's the world we know and that's how we understand it. But with plants in particular, there was a researcher that said that the best way to think about how plants communicate is think of it like plumbing, more so than electrical wires. There are elements of electrical communication between plants, but in general, it is a flow of sugar and of water throughout their entire, I guess, essence body, for lack of a better term. And so this comes from a National Geographic article that really kind of summarizes the bulk of this really cool research, which is that electrical signals travel through the movement of chemicals in those tubes, referring to the plumbing side of plants, explains Courtney Jom, a biologist and NSF program director who studies plant interactions. For example, roots can detect drought and tell the leaves to limit transpiration and conserve water. So the roots will inform what the leaves should do, and the leaves will inform what the roots should do.
I think that's really interesting. And when you said that, I was trying to think of like, oh, well, where's the plant's brain?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like maybe there isn't one central location in the way that like our human brain is organized, because you said like the roots inform the leaves and the leaves can inform the roots.
So this brings me to like the first little bit that I want to talk about within this idea of how plants communicate. There are actually companies now that develop little products that will take the electrical signals within a plant and convert them into sound.
Oh yeah, I know all about this. I have seen people on TikTok do this and take a different plant or even like a fruit or a vegetable or something and say, oh, this is the music of a mushroom. This is the music of a snake plant.
So yes, plants make sounds, and the way that usually people listen to their plants is they'll put little electrodes on them and they will just detect the difference between electrical impulses and all that. And then they will take that and translate it into sound. But that's not the only way that plants make sound. In fact, we'll get into this a little bit deeper, but plants communicate through sound as well, through little vibrations. And they communicate through what's known as ultrasonic sound, which is a higher frequency sound than we can hear as humans. And so there are a few different animals that are likely to be able to hear when plants are doing their thing. And of those, roaches and rodents can hear up to 40,000 kilohertz, and we can only hear up to 20,000 kilohertz. So researchers that are trying to figure out this whole plants making noise bit are trying to figure out what animals are able to react to them. And a good way that we can understand what that would be like for humans to react to something like that is, the smell of fresh cut grass.
Oh, fondly.
Fondly, right? Well, I'm about to ruin it a little bit for you. You're smelling a distress chemical from the grass. And so
you've ruined it a lot now, actually.
And so it's basically saying like, oh no, distress. But because
they're being cut.
But because we associate it with being outside and warm summer days, we have a positive feeling about it. And so it kind of calls into question little bits of us cultivating outdoor spaces to meet specific social standards or aesthetic appearances, and how that fits within plants and the health of a ecosystem.
That one's tough because, I mean, grass lawns are already a problem, and I think we all kind of know why, like water scarcity, and just it's really, really bad for biodiversity. But you're right. I think that smell is something that a lot of people connect to childhood, summer break, and just being outside. And so why wouldn't that be a positive kind of memory?
Yeah.
And in the same way, why would a human be thinking about that smell in any other way besides that? Even before this research came out, like, why would that cause us to question what that scent means?
It's one of those things where I think when we get into the what makes plants different than life, you're talking a bit about how there isn't a centralized nervous system or like a sole spot of this is where instruction comes from, a queen bee or whatever.
No, I'm not saying that at all.
But it does react to stress and harmful environments.
Again, that's not what I'm getting at, because I actually probably believe more so what you're saying I don't. What I'm saying is, with this smell of fresh cut grass, why would humans ever have the knowledge or even the concern to think that it was anything more than a smell? That's all. It's like a simple observation of our understanding of plants.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with how I think we should think about them, because I know we're going to get into that probably soon. But we have to start somewhere saying, okay, if this is in fact true, why should humans care?
Yeah. It's a difficult question. There's a lot of ways that we can approach why or how to feel motivated to care about something like this, because it is quite difficult to wrap your head around. The other thing that I want to talk about with this is that it is sending a distress signal, like a fragrance, a chemical in the air. And these signals are used amongst a lot of different plants. They're used for signaling to bees which flowers have been pollinated and which ones haven't. They're used to help protect plants when there are potentially like invasive fungi attacking its roots or whatever. They are just a signal as well.
So it seems like the olfactory sense is highly used by plants.
Yes.
Which I think is really cool, because to me, out of all of the 5 senses, that would probably be the last one that I would assume plants are using for communication. Obviously, we understand plants are very fragrant. Flowers are fragrant. That's why we love them so much.
Yeah.
But I'd never think in a million years that has to do with the communication between plants, which I think is super cool.
And so the quote from that National Geographic article that really roots that idea is, as humans, we may not be able to naturally hear them, referring to plants, but we can often smell plant messages. When grass is cut, it releases gaseous chemicals, a fragrant distress signal. It's a comforting scent for those of us who associate it with being outside in warmer months. But plants also release this scent when eaten by a caterpillar. As if responding to their call for help, other bugs take notice and prey on those caterpillars. So what's interesting is plant gets eaten by a caterpillar, right? Caterpillars hanging around on the branches. And then other bugs will smell it and see that as a signal, oh, there's a caterpillar to eat. So there is like this happens, then this happens, then this happens, a chain reaction of sorts.
Well, you're just describing like how an ecosystem works. But I think it's really cool to bring it down to that really small little event that humans, yes, we can see it, but more likely than not, we're not going to be paying attention to that. Like, we know caterpillars eat plants. We know other bugs eat caterpillars. But I don't think we are thinking about why that exists. And I think it's really cool to kind of give that power back to the plant almost. That it's like that living plant seems to be way more important and kind of more in control in that local ecosystem than we might have been led to think.
It's really easy to discredit plants. And I think historically, if you look at how humans talk about life, plants kind of get thrown to the wayside because they tend to be...
Oh, they're not talked about at all.
They tend to be more static. And it was interesting. I've been reading through that Leonardo da Vinci biography, and he was a vegetarian for a good period of time. And he wrote a lot about how he was morally against eating animals. What was interesting too is that he would purchase animal products if he was feeding other people that would eat it. So it was an interesting, like, this is his personal feeling, but he did draw a line between animals and plants. Like, he kept on trying to say that this is the line that we don't cross. And then you hear some of this research and it starts to muddy that line a little bit and make you think about, because he was describing it as animals interact with their environment in a certain way. They move in a certain way. They behave in a certain way. And plants move too. We know that forests can migrate. We know that leaves will orient themselves towards the sun. So it starts to make that definition of plant and animal a bit more muddy.
Definitely. I think this research challenges a lot of morals that many vegetarians and vegans have, myself included. And I'll wait until a little further down the episode to give my real 2 cents on this, because I think there is a difference.
Yeah.
Not in the way that each life is valued differently, but in the way that humans interact with those lives.
Yes.
And that's, to me, that's where the real moral stands. Is it has nothing to do with the soul or the importance of that life. It has to do with how humans are treating both plants and animals very differently.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear where you're going to go with that. So we'll have to, wait and see. Listen here,
folks.
We have a great podcast. At least we think so.
And we hope you do too.
But we are also the only 2 people on this podcast, so we could be a little delusional about this take.
And because of that, we're looking for viewers like you to tell it to us straight. Are we a good podcast or are we not?
We want to interact with you.
We want your opinion.
Your opinion.
You can find us at the Can I Tell You Something podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, where you'll hear us talk about things like, I don't know, do plants have feelings?
What is the Myers-Briggs personality test?
Who is Steve G?
And what do you think about the Barbie movie?
All that and more at the Can I Tell You Something podcast.
The other thing I wanted to add with this how plants talk to one another is that researchers have also learned plants can send messages through volatiles about specific threats they're facing, like predation. Plants neighboring a volatile emitting plant have been observed to prepare to defend against a threat before they experience it themselves. So part of what's going on too is that when a plant sends a signal, other plants react to that signal as well, even if they aren't directly facing that threat. And we'll get into it a bit later, but that helps older trees take care of younger trees that might be facing threats, helps certain saplings grow in more hostile environments. The plants look out for each other is, I think, what's really interesting about it.
I like to do this thing with our house plants. Make sure that they always have a buddy near them, even if it's not like directly next to them, just a plant that they can reach out to in times of trouble.
Yes.
Because, and I didn't know this specific research, but I've always felt that some sort of living being needs to be connected to another. And that goes for plants too. And when you bring a plant into your home, you're taking it out of a natural environment and putting it in an environment that isn't outdoors. And so they should be together. And I think that makes sense, especially like this plant behind us, our silly little bunny Francis got into overnight and he ate like half of the leaves. And I was worried. I was like, oh no, this plant is going to die. And it didn't. And I put it next to some other plants and it's healing and the flowers are coming back. So I don't know. I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah. And something I've started to think about through this, because I mean, all the language that they're talking about, a lot of it's here's what's happening above ground, but a lot of it's here's what's happening inside the plant or underground through the roots. And it's made me think about maybe the way that we perceive how healthy a plant is, being through how green it is, how lush it is a bit different than the way that the plant perceives its health. And there might be actually more value in how healthy the roots are as opposed to the stuff that pops above the ground. I think about times where it looks like an entire chunk of plants are dead. And then it rains and then they all turn green overnight, it seems. And it's like, they were just waiting. They were waiting to collect some more sunlight and yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes down to knowledge of specific plants and what they need. You don't necessarily have a background in that. You're still working on your green thumb. Maybe one day you'll have it.
Yeah.
And I'm working on it too, but I genuinely love plants and flowers, and so we have a lot in our home because of that. And over time you learn what, specific variety or species needs what. Does this need to have more direct sunlight or does it need to be sheltered from that? How much water is too much? How do you even water a house plant? There's this guy on TikTok, I forget his handle. If I find it, I'll link it below, but he's super obsessed with plants. And I saw a video once where he said that you should put some of your plants in the shower to mimic rain. And so with our largest plants, I often do that. And I don't know, it kind of brings me some joy knowing that I can bring them some sort of natural world back into their indoor existence. And so I think it really goes back to what's the human's knowledge of the plant too. And like you said, roots probably tell a bigger part of a story than we're willing to admit, but we're never going to see the roots because if we did, that means we're unearthing the plant.
Yeah.
And we're really only doing that if we're moving it or something of that sort.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It really just comes down to what is the gardener doing. And like I said, my views on plant life and how it matters comes down to humans' treatment of that plant. And all of the gardeners I know are so enthralled with plants that it's only ever, how can I make this life thrive?
Yeah. I remember hearing someone on TikTok, another plant enthusiast, there are tons of them on TikTok, talk about how you can't ever make a plant grow, but you can provide an environment in which they can grow. And to me, that was like the first time that my thumb started tinging a bit green, in that I realized that there is no exact formula for what will make every plant grow. But if you think about where that plant is situated, and is this an environment in which they would grow, then it changes the way you approach taking care of plants.
Exactly. And let's just be honest here. Plants are so expensive that when you actually put the time and money aside to care for a plant, the last thing you want is for it to die, because then you have to go to the store and replace it, especially if it's, I don't know, like a silly variety that cost $100 for one clipping. Like, you're going to do everything you can to keep that plant alive, even if it's for selfish reasons. That's how humans work.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have learned about a bit about how plants communicate with each other. We learned that they make some noise, that they make some smells. And I want to actually talk about one bit of research because it has a little bit of my expertise, not being the green thumb, but more in the computing and data stuff. There is a bit of research that's out there that they trained an AI model to be able to detect certain conditions amongst tomato and tobacco plants. And the conditions were distress and dehydration. And so what they did is they put these plants in a space where they could capture ultrasonic sound. And they were able to actually differentiate between whether it was the tomato plant or the tobacco plant to over 90% accuracy in terms of just a passive state. And then certain distress at like 70% accuracy. And the research basically is the first of its kind where it's trying to understand what plant sounds mean what. And it was fascinating because it's just that it's a first look into, could we listen to plants to deliver them what they need at any given moment? And there was a lot of stuff talking about how further exploration in this specific field might be really helpful for agriculture, might be really helpful for when we're thinking about how our environment's changing really quickly, and it's going to make it more and more difficult for certain plants or crops to grow. If we could find a way to listen to those plants based off of their ultrasonic communication or through the chemicals that they emit, it could be just fascinating and really change the way that we interact with plant life. So
I think that's really sweet, because when you dumb all that down from the research, it's just, hey, we need to just listen to them and see and see what they have to say and do our best to help them. That's all this research is doing. And like you said, agriculture would be a huge part of that, and probably more importantly, helping to fight climate change.
Absolutely.
On a probably small scale, but if you were to branch this out into larger ecosystems, the impact could potentially be very large. And I haven't heard that before, and I think that's really cool.
So in this research about sounds that plants emit, I learned that plants that are under distress will communicate more than when they're happy. So when looking at, so I'm going to show you at least this, and we'll throw it up on the screen. But one of the graphs right here shows the difference in number of tomato sounds, which is a great, great y-axis. Number of tomato sounds for dry tomatoes versus irrigated tomatoes. It's just tons more noise comes out of plants that need help. And so what's interesting about that is if you think about training up this whole model to identify plant noises, they're going to make noises when they need help, is
which
what I'm
makes
thinking.
Sense. Doesn't all life do that? Like, let's bring it to a human perspective. If a human is in distress, they're probably going to complain, ask for help, maybe scream, maybe cry, maybe whine. But if not, if they're content, they're probably just going to go on with their life. So why wouldn't that apply to plants? That makes so much sense.
It makes so much sense. And I think that the thing that gets me really excited about seeing it in numbers is then it makes us more confident that when we listen to plants, we're getting the right signal. Because that's really what it comes down to. It's one thing to be able to detect a noise. It's a whole other thing to be able to interpret it. And that's what's so interesting about this. I mean, they're able to interpret the difference between dryness and like other sorts of distress where they're like taking clippings from the plant through sound. Just think about that.
Okay, I'm thinking about it, and now I'm thinking, is this getting too complicated for how we should be caring for plants. Like, let's go back in time and reflect how people have cared for plants for all of our human history.
Yeah.
We've been doing it since the start.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been acquiring a lot of knowledge about this. So now, today, we understand plants really, really well. Maybe not their feelings and their communication, but we understand how to cultivate them and keep them healthy, yada, yada, yada. Is training AI models, for example, maybe a misuse of time and funds when we could just look at the plant and say, oh, it's been a while since I watered you. Let me help you out.
So that's a great question. I think it's how far is too far in terms of some of this research. What's really important to remember is that this is like the first kind of study of its kind. So before this, we didn't even know that plants could communicate through ultrasonic waves. Now we know that they can, and now we know that there are differences between those waves. And so, yeah, is it maybe overcooking the chicken to do this whole study? Sure. But as our initial point of entry into what this could generate in terms of our understanding of plants and ecosystems, I think it's a-okay to use things like AI to start to understand these things. The benefit of AI, and I got to be crystal clear about this because you will see so much stuff on LinkedIn, like use AI for this, use AI for that, blah, 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 blah. The benefit of AI is that you can start to sort things that are really abstract or difficult to define. And you can do so if you can capture a lot of information about it and then say, hey, this is how it should be sorted. And then it's like, okay, now I can go out in the real world and sort things.
And that, that I understand.
Yeah.
What I was referring to is specifically this tomato graph that you shared with the dryness and the
irrigated tomatoes. Yeah.
To me, that's like, okay, come on, use the brain and the eyes that you were given and look at the plant and you'll know when to water it. That is where I'm like, okay, I think that's a little much, but I completely agree with you that there could be really, really useful applications of this, and it's probably going to come in a form of large scale agriculture.
I like to also think of this as, dry tomatoes versus irrigated. Like, of course, you can tell when something doesn't have enough water. Of course. As
well, not everyone. A lot of houseplants die every day due to this.
Thousands of millions of billions.
We need to raise awareness for those without a voice.
Do you know someone that is keeping plants hostage in their apartment and refusing to water them?
Do they claim that all they can keep alive is a cactus?
Get help. Please. It's a ridiculous sort of juxtaposition between the two.
But I also understand that you have to train AI models on things that are really self-explanatory to us. So maybe I'm going to give them benefit of the doubt. Maybe that's all this is.
Yes.
But I have to be critical here.
Of course.
Because there are just so many people who I think take technology and are using it for things that it has no use doing.
Overgeneralizing.
Like just for the sense of saying that they're pioneers in that field. Yeah. It's like, no, you're not. We've actually been farming tomatoes for centuries.
Yeah.
But thanks. Thanks for your help.
So next I want to talk about plant fungi. And yes, they're fun little guys.
I was going to ask that joke.
And they're such fun little guys that they form alliances with trees.
Well, of course they do. Don't a lot of them literally live on trees?
Totally. But
the tree's the landlord of the fungi.
But the funny bit with all of this, though, is when you have an alliance, that implies that you have an adversary.
Oh no, who is it?
some other trees. Yeah. So when I say fungi have alliances, they don't just like any trees. They have particular trees that they like the most. And so this, I'm going to add a quote for this because I had no idea that it was like this. Interesting conversations happen when fungus meets root. The two parties have been observed swapping bits of small RNA, which alter gene expression in the other organism. So, in a good way, symbiotic relationship, they're helping each other out. But if the fungus is an ally, it says, you can trust me, and it helps the plant grow. If the fungus is a foe, the small RNA from the fungus turns off the plant's defense genes, making it easier for the fungus to attack, says Rwant.
Oh my gosh, that's quite violent.
When multiple trees are connected by one fungus, they can share resources. Carbon has been traced going through an older nurse tree through fungal networks to another younger tree that's too young to get a good source of light and photosynthesize.
Total side note, I love nursing trees. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a fallen tree that usually on like a forest floor has provided quote unquote kind of like a nesting ground for new plants to grow, and those nutrients from that fallen tree are then transferred in to those new little saplings. And I just think that that is really, really sweet. I will provide a photo because I want to.
After we went to the rainforest in Washington, I started to notice where it happens throughout Seattle, because there are pieces of wood that are just kind of left there to rot away that will start to have little groups of small plants growing out of them. And so it's the same phenomena, but in our urban environment. I think it's really cool to see.
It is cool. There's like a sewer grate that we noticed the other day walking the dogs that has just a little plant growing through it. And, cars are driving over it. It's the last place that you would expect to see some greenery. And yet the plant is thriving.
Yeah.
I just think that's really cool. And we see that a lot in Washington specifically, just due to all of our rainfall and our climate. But, you see that all around the world, is plants can be so incredibly tenacious in the way that they survive. And I've always thought that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So back to the fungi and this whole you are my friend or maybe you're not so much my friend thing. I'm curious, how does that change your perception of that particular symbiotic relationship? You have a fungus and a tree that have a preference to one another over other trees and fungus.
So personally,
yes.
I have always been anti-fungi. Probably because they kind of gross me out, they kind of creep me out, and I'm allergic to a lot of them.
Yes.
So I just I wouldn't say I've really had a partnership or an allyship with fungi myself. So when I hear this research, you know what? I'm so not surprised, because they have always seemed so incredibly suspicious to me. And compared to all the other plants that I've come in contact with in my life, those ones you have to watch out for. Sorry for the fungi lovers out there. I'm sure you exist. But
I think that also says something a bit interesting about how we value certain plants that aren't threatening versus parts of life that are threatening.
Well, and it goes back to how do humans experience them, right? Throughout time, we had to learn what are the poisonous plants and what are the non-poisonous plants. What berries can I eat and what fungus should I stay away from? And so it makes sense that over time, we are going to favor one plant over another.
Yeah, it's interesting. That also leads into some theories around why we have phobias around certain animals. A lot of people are scared of snakes, and there's a theory that it's because whether it's culturally that it kind of is is brought up over and over again that snakes can kill people. Venom's not good.
Yeah, I think venom and those bites is what really freaks people out. The same thing with spiders.
Yeah.
No one wants to get bitten by a poisonous spider, or any spider for that matter.
Yeah.
And yeah, that totally translates to plants. Even like some house plants that are poisonous. For example, this silly little plant behind us is poisonous to rabbits. My bunny got into it. He was fine. But then I'm like, oh, why would I bring such a wretched poisonous plant into my home? And then, then I start thinking about the plant differently because of it. And so I think humans really hold on to a poisonous notion.
Yeah, it's just interesting. We create all these little mental models around to create kind of a set of rules or simple guidelines to not get ourselves in danger.
Well, look, no one wants to die from eating the wrong fungus.
That's fair.
That would be the worst way to go.
It would be up there for sure.
And so over time, as humans reproduce, they're going to tell their offspring, stay away from that fungus. It's bad news. And, that happens for centuries. And here we are not being able to handle mushrooms.
Hey,
Can I tell you something?
Sure.
is a podcast that you can listen to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube. And if you want to check out our social media, go to TikTok or Instagram or Threads.
Well, by golly, Jim Willikers, I think I will.
With all of this that we've learned, I think that this is where we start to get into that bigger discussion. We have some new information about how all of these characters in this room are talking to one another. Maybe they're saying nice things about us, maybe not. But I do want to ask those three questions again, and we'll go through them one by one. So first I'll say all three, and we'll start with question one. The first is, what makes plants different from animals? The second, when does something become life? And third, at what point is life entitled to human rights?
Okay, let's get into it.
First, how would you define the difference between a plant and an animal?
I'm going to plainly say that I don't believe there is a difference.
Can you expand upon that? Because I think for a lot of people, they would say, what are you even talking about?
Sure. So before you gave us this research, I was going to say, I think the only difference between plants and animals is that animals can migrate. And then I was thinking like, well, that's dumb because plants migrate constantly. Like, where do you think their little seeds are traveling through the air for? And so then I was thinking, okay, well, if that's not a difference, then what is? We learned that plants are constantly communicating, and we learned that plants are supporting one another and helping each other grow. And to me, that's just describing a thriving environment and a system that has been built to further the offspring that they produce, which is exactly what animals and humans do, just kind of in a different way. And so to me, that style of life doesn't differentiate them at all. They're very different. Like, obviously, different animals, the ones that we understand, the ones that we typically live with, are more inclined to support us. And plants necessarily don't do that for us. And so humans are interpreting plant life and human life and animal life differently based on how they aid us. Yeah. But to me, there is no difference. And, something people might say is, oh, well, plants don't have a soul. How can you know? How can you say that they don't?
I think about, too, with, like, what is the difference between plants and animals, right? If we want to talk about the communication and the expansiveness of that communication, if I were to take, like, a human brain and blow it up to the size of a forest, I bet you the way it communicates would be very similar to the way that trees communicate with one another. There are paths, there are roots, there are branches, there are all sorts of things. Like, we know that this is look at how the nervous system looks. It's all just roots, and like, it's a general pattern that shows up in a lot of life. And so for me, the difference between plants and animals, I feel like the line that I'm going to draw is a weird one. I feel like animals tend to be much more flash in the pan sort of life. They, I think, are a lot less resilient than plants. Think about how like a mass extinction event tends to be around animals and less so around plants, unless there's variety of other sort of factors happening. But it's like plants tend to be slower moving when they migrate. If they're going to move towards the sunlight, it is almost incomprehensibly slow that they'll change the angles and stuff. So I think that the way I see it is plants are like a much longer life form compared to animals. But I don't know if that even makes sense.
No, I understand that. And I think it's fair to bring up just lifespan in general. Like we know certain trees can live hundreds of years if their environment allows for that. And that's always blown me away. Like we know human life is fleeting, and a lot of other animals we live with, you know, they might only be around for a couple years if they're lucky enough to make it that far. And a lot of plant species, you know, that's nothing to them. And that's really interesting. But I don't think that's a fair criteria to differentiate, especially when you were saying, well, plants are, they can handle more than animals can. Well, that's not fair, because now you're changing the criteria for what certain life can handle and what they're built for, especially like mass extinctions. Well, of course, plants are going to outlive that. There's more of them, and it takes a lot more to like fully rid a species of plants because they are so widespread.
Yeah. And that's where it's like I really have a hard time trying to wrap my mind around. Could I say that does it do X, Y, Z, or does it do blank is really difficult to draw that line and be somewhat comfortable with defending it. I think it's just interesting. I think that if you were to talk to like a biochemist, they would probably talk about, you know, on a cellular level where the differences are.
Right. And that's, I think, a really important distinction to bring up. We're more talking about the idea of life, philosophizing what that difference is. Whereas, of course, on a cellular or even molecular level, there's probably thousands of differences. But that's not really what we're talking about right now. And I think that's the fun of it. When it seems almost impossible to find those differences, that's when you start valuing these plants as life that should be valued.
I think that brings us into our second question. When does something become life?
Oh man, this could really get political here, couldn't it? So I'm going to give my non-political answer.
Okay.
And I'm going to give my political answer. Because unfortunately, we do have to address that. Because there's reason to.
Mm-hmm.
My first inclination when speaking about any living being, plants, animals, humans, what have you, is something becomes life the moment a soul or essence, whatever you want to call it, is attached to that being. Sad thing is, I don't know when that happens. I don't think I'll ever know when that happens. I don't think living humans, will ever understand that. Therefore, my political answer is something becomes life the moment it's born. I say that because I am very pro-choice. I will be until the day I die. And unfortunately, when we talk about this question, it's often going to be brought up in a human sense when talking about abortion. Now, I don't want to make this episode about that, but we do have to acknowledge that sometimes we think one way and have to present the answer differently due to what's going on in the world around us. Now, abortion and women's rights doesn't apply to plants. So that's where I say, well, my first inclination is about the soul.
Mm-hmm.
That's my answer.
I asked this question because I was thinking about more cosmically. I forget who says this, but some wise old person said, if you let kind of stars exist long enough and let the universe exist long enough, eventually matter assembles itself in a way that it questions why it's there.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say for a fact that every single thing that exists here on Earth is just a byproduct of stardust. That's it. Because the only reason why we have any of those elements on the periodic table is because of fusion, star stuff. So we are a byproduct of that cosmically. And so I think then what I was thinking about is, at what point does this collection of atoms and molecules transcend it's just a star or it's just a burning ball of gas and become what we classify as life?
And I think that's where the soul comes in, is there's some missing element that the stardust just doesn't have. It has what can sustain life, but it doesn't have what makes life want to sustain.
Yeah.
And you need both of that to survive, no matter what you are. If you're a plant, a little bunny rabbit, or a human, it doesn't matter. And that's why I get so frustrated when people say that animals don't have souls and that only humans can. And I really wonder how people get there. Because like you said, we all kind of share that same stardust makeup. We're not all that different from one another. We might have different survival techniques. We might have had different time on this earth that allows us to get to where we are. But down on that, just what we're made of level, I think we're all really, really similar. We meaning life.
Yeah.
And so that's how I choose to classify life, and why I value animals, and probably now after this plants, on the same exact level that I value humans. And I've talked about this a lot now on this podcast, and it really frustrates me when other humans are putting humans at the way top and making it kind of this pyramid of who's on bottom and who's on top. It's such a shallow way of looking at the world. And I wish that more people would at least take the time to question why they feel that way.
Yeah, I like that perspective. And so the final question I have is, at what point is something that starts resisting, we'll call it life for the sake of this, at what point is life entitled to human rights? And I will root this in New Zealand. There is a river that has been designated human rights. We have some rules out there right now that give certain things a lot of protections. And because of how valuable a piece of our environment is, I will just say that how valuable our whole environment is to sustaining life, to sustaining all of our health, it should be considered equal to the rights of that of a human. You shouldn't be allowed to destroy, maim, and harm the environment in a way that you would get punished for harming another human in that way. It's it does make things more complicated, but I think, to me at least, it says this is one of our fastest ways to be able to start protecting things that exist in our natural environment, is to start saying they deserve the same legal protection as humans.
I think that this question, in general, at what point do other life forms deserve human rights, is really great, because on one hand, it's asking you to think about other living beings. But on the other hand, it's asking you to think, well, what are human rights? And what do they do for humans in the first place? Because obviously we were the ones who made them. There is a set of universal human rights out there that have to be followed by every living being on the planet. But then when you go from country to country, that starts to change. And it's really tough because if everywhere you go on the planet as a human, your rights are changing, how can you then apply that universally to all other life forms? And how can you assume that those rights should be pushed upon another life form?
It's a really fair question.
And I think it's tough too, because when we talk about human rights and, like you said, that river, well, humans are the ones deciding what life form gets the rights and what life form doesn't.
That's something where it gets a bit more challenging, right? That's where you have to abstract what is human rights versus what is something that is culturally significant, culturally valued to that specific place. So I don't think that there is a generalizable human rights equals plant rights in these basic, like, it's not that simple. It's all contextual. And a big part of that context that I think we need to consider is that every culture values things differently. And so what mental model works best in the space that you're in to be able to support a thriving ecosystem or a thriving environment, a place where humans can coexist with other life and live in that balance without overstepping. Without overstepping. I don't think that humans should be entitled to the excess that we've decided we're entitled to.
Oh, I agree with that. And I wish that could be possible, but when you look at how large our population is, well, now there's too many people, and so we have to depend on that excess just to survive.
Exactly.
And it sucks because at one time on Earth, hundreds of years ago now, we were able to live in that harmony, and people were able to, raise livestock and trade them and sell them and eat them in a way that wasn't harming their populations in the way that it is now. And in the same way with agriculture, there was small farming for villages, maybe towns, that people could raise and sell their crops to survive and eat. And it wasn't harming the environment in the way it is now because our agriculture, it's far too large scale. And so that's why we have to bring in all of these horrible practices of, well, how do we save the soil's nutrients now that we've drained it all? Yeah. That shouldn't have even been a question that had to come in to mind. And so when I talk about how humans are interacting with other life forms and why that matters, that's why. Because we've abused that power that we've had in harnessing other life and taking it for our own greed and excess. So, after our fun philosophizing and your fact-finding, I think it's time for our episode debrief.
I believe it is that time.
So, what did you learn from this episode that maybe goes beyond just the facts that you presented?
This episode challenged quite a few of my assumptions. Some of the things that we think are the most human out there, being able to chat with one another, being able to listen, know what someone else is saying. Plants just blew it out of the water on this one. They are so much more complicated and so much more interconnected than I could have ever thought to begin with. And actually, I'm very happy about it. It makes me feel less alone in that humans are having all these thoughts and feelings, knowing that plants very much are as chatty as us to some capacity. I like it. It brings them to life in a way that my human brain can understand a bit more. And then with the big picture stuff, it's always cool to see a use of AI that is for something like We want to hear what the plants have to say. Like, that sort of stuff just warms my heart. And it's becoming more and more possible. People are getting better and better at using this stuff. And it's always great to find instances where a non-computer science specific discipline is able to use something like AI. It shows that there is that cross collaboration that's so essential for answering some of the most difficult questions we have.
That's what I was going to comment on as well, is that AI that we're referencing, that we were laughing about the graph of non-irrigated versus irrigated tomatoes. And to me, I'm always just super skeptical about AI, because you're right, it does seem to be used in an only technical sense. And for someone like myself who doesn't really feel drawn to that world, it's always a little bit to me. But in a sense like this, it makes me really excited, because it is kind of in that beginning or primitive stage where the AI is just trying to figure out probably even what a tomato is and what we do with it. And it makes you wonder what possibilities can come from that. And maybe, like we said, how agriculture specifically needs to change in order for us to survive and thrive with plants. And maybe AI could actually play a really big role in that. I think it'll be fun to kind of keep up with that research and see where it goes, because yeah, it is in the beginning stage, but I don't know, it just takes a couple of years probably for something to really take off and be really helpful for us. So that's what I learned, is just to maybe give AI a little break and let them do some silly projects, because it might really, really pay off.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us for episode 11 of the Can I Tell You Something podcast. It's been a blast. We were so glad that you could join us with all of our plants.
Yes, our lovely forest that we brought into the studio today. And we want to hear your thoughts on this episode, specifically probably the 3 questions we asked. What are your remarks? How do you react to that? And just overall, how you enjoyed the episode. So let us know on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. I think Spotify also has the option at Can I Tell You Something podcast, something spelled SMTH.
And we'll throw that on the screen for those of you with a visual right now.
Yes. But until then, we will see you next week.
Right. Bye.
Bye.